Hello, it's Toaster Party, and today I'm going to talk about what my picks are for the 5 strongest cards for Modern from 2022. Overall, this is a pretty powerful year for the format, not as powerful as, say, 2021 was with the release of Modern Horizons 2, but there were still a lot of really powerful cards printed this year. So without further ado, let's get into the list, starting things off with number 5 on Licensed Hearse. For 2 generic mana, you get an artifact vehicle that says you can tap it to exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards exiled with it. Its crew cost is 2. So, what really put this card on this list is the fact that it was repeatable graveyard hate, and it also would function as a aggressive piece later on in the game. Where this saw the most play was the low to the ground tempo-y type strategies like Izzet Murktide, where you could use it to remove your opponent's graveyard so they couldn't cast an early Murktide, and in the late game you would be able to use it to just start hitting your opponent. With the amount of graveyard decks that appeared in the format this year, this card was incredibly powerful and saw a lot of play. Let's move on now to number 4, Leyline Binding. For 5 generic and a white, you got an enchantment with flash with the ability of Domain that said this spell costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. When Leyline Binding enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield. So, I put extra sarcasm on the 5 generic mana cost because you're only ever paying 1 for this. Because of the existence of fetch lands and triomes, you always had 5 different land types on the field whenever you'd be casting this. So you essentially got an Oblivion Ring for 1 mana. Where this card saw the most play was in decks like 4-color Omnath, where they were already having the multiple different land types, so it would already be super cheap to cast this for Omni removal, and in the Cascade decks where, because they can't play lower to cost stuff, the fact that this card technically has a higher mana cost meant that they have much better interaction for the earlier turns before they attempt to combo off using their Cascade spells. Let's move on now to number 3. This one I had to split between Boseiju and Otawara. Boseiju is probably the slightly better of the 2 channel lands here because of its channel effect. Channel being discard the card, and then you get a specific effect. Boseiju's effect is to destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. This costs 1 less for each legendary creature you control. So, where Boseiju was mostly used was in decks like Tron and Amulet, or any deck with Wrenn and 6, because in those first 2 decks, you'd be using it to remove problematic artifacts or enchantments that prevent you from getting all the extra mana out of it, or stuff like Blood Moon. But in decks with Wrenn and 6, they could constantly rebuy this over and over and over, destroying any heavy artifact deck like Infinity or Hammer Time, or just eventually start attacking the land base because eventually an opponent's going to run out of non-basic lands. With Otawara, you got the ability to channel it for 3 generic and a blue to discard it to return an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So what basically made this card really powerful was the fact that it was not really removal, but it was an incredibly powerful effect attached to a card that fundamentally was just a basic land. So for almost 0 opportunity cost, you could be running this in the deck, and if you really needed to use it as a piece of removal, it was there to be able to use that way. So overall, just a very generic card, if not pretty powerful one. So let's move on now to number 2, Ledger Shredder. For 1 generic and a blue, you got a Bird Advisor with flying that says, whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. That being, draw a card, discard a card, and if the discarded card was a non-land card, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. So, this card was probably the most slept on card when it came out, because for the first week or 2, this card was 25 cents. I almost bought a playset prior to the day that it jumped to $25. So, this card is incredibly powerful due to the massive amounts of cheap or free powerful cards in the format. Alongside cards like Mishra's Bauble, this card was constantly triggering, giving both card selection and a very powerful attacker. Because within the first turn or two that this was on the field, it could get up to a 3-5, or if your opponent was casting a lot of spells, it becomes like a 4-6, and a 4-6 for 2 is incredibly powerful. Where this saw the most play was in decks like Izzet Murktide, where they were already casting a lot of cheap spells, and in things like Grixis Death Shadow for much the same reason. So let's move on now to number 1. And that number 1 is really 5 different cards, that being the new Triomes. Those being Spara's Headquarters, Zeator's Training Ground, Rafine's Tower, Jetmir's Garden, and Xander's Lounge. So Triomes are an incredibly powerful land type that are ETB tapped lands with the ability cycling 3, but the most important part is that they have 3 different searchable land types off of fetch lands. So what makes these cards powerful is that it makes it way easier to be able to play 5-color decks or 4-color decks, or maybe even just some 3-color decks, because you can just search up a card that is all of your land types. And while they enter the battlefield tapped, because you're using fetch lands, it means that the opportunity cost of being able to play one of these on turn 1 if you don't have a spell to use is incredibly low. It feels a little bad when you open it in your opening hand and you want to cast a spell, but that's going to happen way less often than you're going to be able to just search this whenever you need it. These cards are all incredibly powerful, and we're able to push a lot of really powerful decks even further into playability, such as the 4-color Omnath deck being able to just have access to better land base, or it being things like even just like Jund having the ability to cycle the Zeator's Proving Ground to run in 6. These cards had a lot of impact on the format, and while they seem unassuming, they're pretty easily the best cards that were printed for Modern this year. Well, thank you all for watching. I hope you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you all have an excellent day.